Hello, this is Jim Schaefer, executive producer and host of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. Our guest today is Randall Baier, and we'll be talking about books that Rip Rap has received for review. Our first book is aptly named Disconnect by Deborah Davis. You want to?
Well, let's take a look at this, Jim. The truth about cell phone radiation, something that's close to my heart or close to my ear. I've always wondered about this, and it's been bantering back and forth, for, well, I don't know, 20 years really. Before that, the precedent to that was radiation from computer screens and from computer CPUs, just from computers in general, but especially screens, I guess. Those big screens, which we don't have anymore, but CRTs. Because I've read myself, followed that, just study within the past year came out that was, it seemed pretty conclusive to me, that they definitely were picking up radiation, in the zone, and they're seeing that the radiation has affecting the areas of the brain that are right in there, because they've been testing that. Hopefully this book will put that in perspective.
Well, a lot of people don't realize that the cell phone is a pretty intense electromagnetic field, and the antenna is right near your ear because it's at the back of the phone, and that's just micromilliliters away from your brain.
Right.
And that's really intense. When you think about it, you're getting the signal from miles away into a device that's held right by your brain.
Exactly. Well, the just in practical terms, what I've seen recommended is that you use a headphone or some kind of device so that the antenna is physically away from you, and then the sound is simply carried up. What I've also read is that these Bluetooth devices that hang on your ear, the verdict is not out on them yet, because Bluetooth is a different, much lower radiation, a magnetic, electromagnetic field. But I'm sure some researchers might,
well, I
disagree
thought it
with
was
that.
Interesting, because we use these technologies and we don't think about the extended consequences of what it is to use them, like you were saying, computers. And there is radiation coming from them. The question is, what's the impact, the long-term impact? And, the intensive use of computers isn't really all that far, long ago in terms of human history. It's like, 20 years, 30 years, it's been really intensely used.
Yeah, right.
We still really don't know what the effect is, but and for the human body, it takes years and years of research under very controlled conditions to fully
determine these. Yes, right, yeah.
And I've seen studies that go on both sides of the issue. Also, the cell phone companies are always defending and saying, no, there's nothing wrong with it, and then other people doing research on brainwaves are saying, well, wait a minute, some pretty intense stuff going on there.
I think if you look at the pure research, there's definitely proof. Can I use the word proof? That there is an effect, an electromagnetic effect on the brain. To what extent that will build up and cause cancer and debilitative diseases.
Frequency of use. I mean, with new technologies coming in, you test at one level of usage, but then as people use them more and more, like on the highway, I see people driving along with their cell phone up to their ear all the time. Then what's the effect of that? It seems to me it would compound the effect enormously if you always have your cell phone at your ear rather than answering every so often. And it seems to me that I call it the fifth appendage. I mean, there's always someone talking on cell phone.
Exactly. I mean, if you have somebody that has a very intense communication-based job, the cell phone is they're literally on the cell phone all the time, one switch to the next, not texting. I mean, they're there talking, making deals, making, a contractor, for instance, just constantly speaking with people.
Well, when I was reflecting on this book, I was thinking, I don't think we've come close to even understanding the combined convergence of all these technologies and all the radiation and all the stuff that we're subjecting ourselves too, because we're in a Wi-Fi setup, using cell phones and computers, and these iPhones now that can do multiple tasks at the same time. You can be talking on the phone on some of these iPhones and doing something else. We haven't really thought that through.
Yeah, electromagnetic bandwidth. There is a quote here by Thomas Pynchon, I just saw it, called "The thing that separates life and death is electricity." Maybe I can find it to quote here, but this, I'll try to get it, look through the table of contents here. Goes through a number. This is, by the way, by Devra Davis, published by Dutton. Some clever titles to the chapters. Cell phones cure Alzheimer's, for instance. That's where the life and death question came in. Public health isn't physics. An electrical storm in the brain. How the fires of technology shock and awe. And the world from now on. And then a very practical ending chapter. How to protect yourself and your family. Because it's not going away. I mean, we've totally bought right into it. So,
well, and I've read some of the things like what you're saying is they keep the antenna away from your head by using some kind of device. They have all kinds of ways that you can shut the phone on and off, but we do need to think about this because we really are in an electronic age.
Yeah.
I keep wondering, what are people talking about?
In what way?
You see, their phones are on. They've got laptops.
What kind of conversation could they possibly be having?
All the time. I mean, it's continuous. They're in this bubble of electronic blogging, or Verge or something. That's this fog of recognition, and now this whole thing is tweeting. The Twitter thing and Facebook. And it's starting to have effect politically on countries. That was a factor in the Egyptian overthrow of Mubarak.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking, wow, this is really getting to be a whole nother dimension altogether. But still, people are on these electronic devices. And I use them, but I try not to use them as, try to shape my loose.
Right. So I know exactly. I know what you're saying. The difference between life and death is solely electric. That's the quote I was looking for. We contain the same chemicals and liquids when we are living, breathing, talking, and walking, as we do in the moments right after death. When we are alive, electricity streams from and to the brain because we are made up of atoms, every single one which contains protons, neutrons, and electrons.
But I've seen articles that they write about how people, when they go to the beach now, they're taking all their electronics along with them, and when they're supposedly on vacation, they're not really aware.
Oh, well, this is a social issue, not a physical one, as this is implying, but the social psychology issue. You're right.
But I'm saying in terms of exposure.
How many people know how to really have a vacation?
I'm saying in terms of exposure, it's 24/7. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
Yeah.
Throughout their lives, it really increases the overall exposure.
Yeah.
And what's interesting are people I've seen some suggestions about deliberately disconnecting, which is kind of underneath that title, from the electronic thing because you get so used to it that you go through stages of withdrawal.
Exactly.
I saw a book on silence that really fascinated me, and there's dynamics to silence, but I don't think many Americans ever have.
It's hard to hear silence, to really hear, quote unquote, nothing, because there's so much other sound there, really. But even being out, it may have been a conversation I was having with you at one point during one of these reviews. But it's really hard to find a place, especially in the United States, where you really don't hear anything non-mechanical. I mean, even to be away from to get away from the airplane pathways, because you could be in the deep wilderness of Yosemite or Yellowstone, and you're still going to hear airplanes. But there are some patches where you don't, and it's quiet.
Oh, when on your beach you hear the boats going by.
Churchill,
Which is the,
way up in the Hudson Bay,
but you'll hear
beyond
the boats,
Churchill.
The boats going
You'll hear
by,
the boat, right?
planes going by. People will be
Right.
playing radios. You'll
Yeah.
see people on cell phone.
But that okay. So if you want total silence to do your psychic relaxation experience, I mean, some people go mad when it's silent.
Yeah.
They cannot, especially, that's a real city mouse, country mouse thing. Just can't stand not having activity, noise. They feel completely disoriented, and likewise the other way around.
I just thought this
Yeah,
was an
this-
interesting book that brings
I'd
up.
like to really look at this and see
Yeah.
what some of the facts are.
Because the research, as you said, goes all over the place.
Yeah, yeah.
For and against.
And it's the type of thing that really pushes academic, scholarly research, science research buttons, medical research buttons, because it's on the verge of it's the edge of belief and fantasy and accuracy in terms of what it's a button pusher, because there are so many people who are, it's doomsday. This is going to ruin your head, and the world will all have cancer. And then there are others who are, I guess what I'm trying to say, it's almost like the global warming thing. It brings in true believers on both sides.
But what do you do as a scientist, as a scholar, when the results that you're bringing in are running counter to what the public wants to believe?
Right.
Not accept scientifically,
Right.
but wants to believe in what they want
And
to
what-
do as popular practice.
Right.
There's the rub.
That's the rub.
And people, played down the whole thing of global warming, but we've never had this many tornadoes. We've never had these kinds of storms, ever.
Mm-hmm.
In one point, a couple of weeks ago, there's 200 tornadoes down south.
Yeah.
And these are category 5, 200 miles an hour on the ground for a mile, at 200 miles an hour.
Yeah.
So you're thinking something's really wrong with this picture. And the scientists have been trying to say, well, there's these factors that are messing around with the airwaves.
Yeah.
And then, but that's where it becomes really rough.
Another norm that was challenged, parameter that's challenged, and I mean, you have to sort of be able to figure this out. Just today, I read a blurb from the Cleveland Clinic that, pointing to an article in the New York Times that there's been a new study on salt. And the study is indicating that a high salt diet, or a salty diet, for lack of a better way of explaining it, does not affect high blood pressure or lead to heart attacks. Now that is contrary to medical public, and so the thing is, there was a study supported, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, by the American Medical Association. So there has this kind of imprimatur of, authenticity or something. But a lot of researchers and doctors are out criticizing the study because it was a small study. It didn't look at this. It didn't look at that. So it's moving things along. It could be completely. It's almost as interesting. I was going to say it could be completely bogus or not, but it's almost as interesting to follow the meta discourse around the study as it is to actually find out if salt is going to kill you.
Hopefully
Pretty
it
interesting.
wasn't supported by the salt industry.
Right, exactly.
That's
That's
one of the problems with some of these, where they talk about the effects of something, and they found out that an interested secondary party was sponsoring the research, and then it's really skewed.
exactly.
But I just think this was... The other book that I thought was interesting is Michael's Schuer's Osama bin Laden, which is particularly interesting since the United States just assassinated him. And the book talks about bin Laden as the most consequential figure in world events in the last decade and a half. And here it says he all but disappeared from view. Well, I'm not sure that was true, but he seemed to be less prominent than when they had the bombing in New York on September 11th. But the curious thing is that bin Laden at one point was a U.S. employee.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know, and turned into this guy who brought together the Al Qaeda, which just means list.
Right.
So he brought together all the revolutionaries around the world.
You know, it's interesting. I read a critique today on the visual aspect. The debate today, as you and I are speaking, has been, or not so much a debate, but the big topical issue as well is the United States going, or President Obama giving authority to release photographs. The issue was the myth of Osama bin Laden, OBL, and things like the picture. It's almost like I wish I could explain what this woman was writing, sort of a academic blog on visual studies. That remark about Osama being an employee of the U.S. government, which he was, has become sort of part of this sort of myth, the Osama personality. And so that we have imagery that is associated with OBL. We have sort of characteristics of his personal history. He was from he's from a very successful Saudi family. He was an employee of the U.S. government at one point, and an ally gone bad, all this stuff. But she was commenting on the fact that there's almost an absence of proof in a lot of this stuff. We don't really know the full. What do we know? You could dig it up, I guess, but the common person says, "Oh yeah, Osama bin Laden used to be working for the U.S." That's part of his sort of myth.
Well, I thought what was hilarious is that everyone had the impression he was living in a cave. Not true. He was living in a mansion, kind of encampment.
A well-appointed
in a very well-off suburb,
right,
not far from the capital of Pakistan, Islamabad. And I think
20 cell phones, 15 computers, runners, supporters,
couriers.
Right.
Yeah.
I listened to some discussion about why he would do that. There was a researcher on NPR who helped to discover or helped to try to track bin Laden over the past years, and he did this as an exercise in endangered species. He's a biologist who works on endangered species. So he took parameters of mapping, vectors, I guess, whatever, of for instance, what allows a certain species to flourish in one area and not in another. And so there were certain things that Osama bin Laden had to do in order to escape recognition. Now, the idea of him being in a cave would have meant it would be cold, snowy, but one of the main things is heat recognition. So if he was in a cave and occasionally coming out in an area that's very stark, rocky, communication signals would be detected immediately. But more importantly, in the cold months, the heat of the bodies would be detected instantaneously. That's partly
satellites.
Right. So he triangulated, this biologist, on these various characteristics that Osama bin Laden needed in order to stay alive, in order to be unendangered. And he came within a 200-mile radius of Abbottabad. He thought bin Laden was in Baluchistan, which is 200 miles from where he was. But he found a zone that was almost identical to the compound and the type of house that he had built for himself, with high sides because he was over 6 feet high.
6'7".
Yeah, enormous, like a basketball player, and very recognizable, obviously, so.
But the other common perception is the guy was poor. No way. He was a billionaire. He had inherited his father. The other thing is that somehow he agreed with his father. No, he was in opposition to what his father's position was, I think, and did some work that undid the work of his father's allies. So there's this really fascinating, complicated.
Right. He needed electricity as well because apparently he certainly had medical issues. Apparently there was
diabetes.
The kidney. I guess he had dialysis, but how true that is. But apart from that, what is the book apart from these myths of Osama bin Laden, what are we looking at in this?
Well, it's
in
this
this
whole
book?
thing of trying to genuinely understand it. You know, it's a different religion, it's a different era. I mean, area, a different region, and so there is a tendency to make myths instead of really understanding the guy
Yeah.
and what he was doing. And he also played the United States very cleverly. I mean, he was a very clever player, you know, in a very serious way. But and outwitted the best efforts of the CIA and all these different people who were professionals at searching out these kind of folks.
For a long time.
Yeah.
And they finally somehow uncovered the network of runners and
What I thought
protectors.
in terms of the writing is that the author, this Michael Schur, talked about the difficulty of not trying to make him seem like an admirable man, despite the fact that he had his own version of piety, integrity, and skills, and more like a formidable enemy, which I think also people didn't quite respect the guy and his skill set. I mean, he really was very clever.
Wouldn't you consider Osama bin Laden an international criminal? I mean, a criminal mind, formidable criminal mind who really affected international politics, not just anti-American politics.
Well, I think what I've seen and read and my observation talking with people is the degree of ignorance about him as a person. And the misjudgment is huge, even by professional people. They just tended to underestimate the guy and didn't fully appreciate what he pulled off. I mean, on September 11th, they were able to hijack 5 airplanes simultaneously. In a country that takes great pride in not allowing one hijacking, they did 5. And they all had targets.
At the same time.
At the same time. That's an incredibly complex logistical, aspect to this whole thing. I think that some of it started toning down with Al Qaeda, but they still had a lot of potent stuff. And there's this really awful thing that's been going on in Iraq and Afghanistan that people have lost track of. There are still improvised personnel explosive devices going off every day. There's still suicide bombers going just about every day.
Just on the way over to your house tonight, I heard about yet another one.
Every day, people, even 12-year-old boys or 12-year-old girls and women and men are still blowing themselves up. That's a pretty intense level of commitment, So, but I just think that Westerners, and particularly Americans, have just not really picked up. It's similar to the global warming thing too, because they just didn't really understand the man and what was going on and how complex it was. And another misreading is an American thing. I never forgot Colin Powell talking, well, if you cut off the head, And so a lot of people are so relieved because they think now that Osama bin Laden's done.
Well, the debate of the last couple of days has been Osama bin Laden's sort of been out of circulation in a certain way, and possibly he might have not even been the top number one, especially in recent years, calling.
Well, and I've heard discussions like, okay, since he's dead, then Al Qaeda's done.
Right.
I don't think so. Because the whole Al Qaeda
That's not the way a cadre system like that works.
It's
closed
it's a wide
network of cells or whatever. I mean.
So that's not going to do it. And there's been other experts trying to come on the scene and say, wait a minute, it isn't that simple, And there are also other people who said all this political unrest that's going on in, these Arab countries. They call it the Arab Spring now, or Egypt and Jordan and Bahrain. That there's some people think this is actually nurtured and fostered by Al Qaeda. That it looks like there's no fingerprints there, but really the intent for Al Qaeda was to shift the power away from the American-sponsored governments, And that certainly is going on. It's a real uproar going over there. So it's hard for us to imagine because you got to change. But what's also interesting, and I think this book is interesting, they talk about his apprenticeship, which was in 1979, 1989, and then the Nomad from 1989 to 1996, the Organizer from 1996 to 2001. So I think that any effort where you can start becoming more knowledgeable about someone that you regard as your enemy is a good step in the right direction. And then you have Survivor and Planner from 2001 to 2010. I don't know how many times, some of my students don't think the guy's really dead. And I don't know how many times the United States announced that they thought they had him, or that he one of those tapes who came out and they said, oh, that's not really, and then they would find
elusively
out that it was.
got, right.
And then they talk about the Bin Laden era. So I mean, the guy is certainly was one of those figures that when you're going through it, it's like Hitler or something, you can't really get an accurate assessment of how big and awful the damage is. Something, you just went through something, and we don't know what the
not quite sure how it's going to shake down.
Yeah, but it was, I just thought it was really something that he really wasn't in the cave. He was really right outside the capital of the whole country. And I read an article in the New York Times today that in Pakistan, the military up until the point when this raid happened that killed Bin Laden, the military in Pakistan had a really good reputation. I mean, they were really a fearsome thing. For this raid to be pulled off and them not even be aware of it, I mean, 2 helicopters come in and do all this stuff. They've been embarrassed. Thank you for being on RipEp again.
You're welcome. I'm glad to be here yet again and make sure my life is structured a safer way.
Thank you.